Joining us now to discuss one of those BYU teams that may still have your allegiance and fandom is John Templon of nycbuckets.com. He specializes in NIT bracketology. John, nice to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, guys.
Absolutely. So I think we're all wondering, after BYU beat Gonzaga and stunned the nation, ending that perfect season, and then they go to the WCC tournament and they beat LMU, but lay an egg against St. Mary's. Where do they sit in your current NIT bracket?
Yeah, so I have BYU as a 3 seed, and on my S curve, or kind of the order of all the teams 1 through 32, I have them as the last 3 seeds. So they're kind of right on the edge there.
So you would not say that as of today they are a solid number 3?
No, I don't think so. I think they have too many bad losses to ever be considered a solid number 3, and there's also a lot of major conference tournaments still to be played this week that I think could really shake up that part of the bracket.
Now, if they're one of the top 4 seeds in any of those regions, that would mean that they have a home game at the Marriott Center. Do you see a scenario where how the conference tournaments play out, that BYU would be in a situation where they would not have a home game in the NIT?
My guess is that BYU is going to get a home game in the NIT. BYU tends to get home games in the NIT in general, which just, speaking from past experience, I think they seem likely. And I also think that they have a resume, now that they beat Gonzaga, that justifies it. So that's a win that almost nobody else has anything like it, and it really helps them, I think, when people look at them.
John, there were some that thought that the loss to St. Mary's was so bad that it may drop them in the seeding. Now, why did you keep them as a 3 seed?
Yeah, well, so in the way RPI works, the marginal loss doesn't matter. It matters in kind of maybe how the committee looks at them or something like that. But I thought, given BYU's resume and the teams around them, it didn't make sense to drop them. But if you were to see, like, for instance, a team like Georgia Tech just lost to Pittsburgh yesterday, and that also kept them pretty far down the bracket. So if a team like Indiana or Ohio State was to make a run, or Alabama maybe was to make a run in their conference tournament, then maybe BYU would drop down, but I don't see them going much below a 4 seed.
With the way that expectations are now for BYU basketball under Dave Rose, and understandably so, because more often than not, he is taking them to the NCAA tournament and has won some games in the recent past, the NIT feels like a bit of a consolation prize for the Cougars. That said, the way the bracket is lined up right now, if BYU were to win against Fresno State, and I know this is all hypothetical, they would probably have a rivalry matchup with Utah, which excites a lot of BYU fans. Why is it likely or maybe unlikely that that will actually come to fruition?
Yeah, so Utah still has to play out its entire Pac-12 tournament run, so that'll be interesting to watch in terms of how they end up getting seeded. But I also think if BYU is to drop, maybe, although you could see it as a 1 versus 4 game as well. So I think there are ways it could happen. And one of the reasons that it could happen is because the NIT tries to seed geographically, where they try to pair up groups of teams so that nobody has to travel too far on short notice. So it'll be interesting to see if, maybe a Western kind of pod has both BYU and Utah in it, especially because they play in different conferences, so it's easy to kind of put them near each other.
John, how has the perception of the NIT changed over the years, or has it?
Well, I think it's become a much more formal process, and there was a time when I was doing NIT bracketology that most people just thought that the committee was kind of guessing, and it's become much more standardized, much more like the NCAA selection process, and I think it's easier to understand how it's going to play out. And also the automatic bids that come from the lower tier conferences that where their 1 seed doesn't win the conference tournament has also kind of added something, and an automatic bid kind of element to it that makes it, 1, easier to predict, and 2, kind of gives you those Cinderella flavors in the NIT as well.
Yeah, what kind of selection committee is there for the National Invitation Tournament?
Yeah, there's a selection committee that's similar to the selection committee for the NCAA tournament, but it's instead of the administrators, it's kind of a separate set of people, and so you'll see kind of people you've heard of who do the selection, and they come on and talk on the ESPNU show on Sunday night.
John Templon of NYC Buckets with us, NIT bracketologist. During the first interview on BYU Sports Nation, you said You undervalued BYU. Has that changed at all now that you've been watching the Cougars a little bit closer and maybe with that win against Gonzaga in Spokane?
Well, I think that win against Gonzaga at Gonzaga was kind of the win that BYU was just missing, and was one of the reasons I thought they were in danger of maybe missing the NIT. But once they got that victory, those high-quality wins make it easier to overlook maybe losing 3 bad games or, playing a couple bad games. And I think when you look at BYU's resume and you're comparing it to teams around them, it's easier to keep them higher up now that they have that anchor kind of win in the top 50.
Follow him at NY Buckets. John Templon with us on the Deseret First Credit Union Hotline. John, great to talk to you. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks again, guys.